Some of the greatest men to have ever lived were the founders of this country. They were men of deep conviction, willing to lose all that they had in pursuit of our freedom. Fortunately for posterity, America's greatest artists also lived at this time. As the Revolution was unfolding, each of the artists you will hear about today were thriving in that world-changing period of history, recording for all time the people and the events involved. Copley, Peale, West, and Stewart were the artists whose paintings reveal the inner souls of the heroes of our nation. The first artist we will meet is John Singleton Copley. He was born in Boston in 1738. His father died shortly after he was born, leaving his mother to run their meager tobacco shop. They lived on a wharf that went 2,000 feet out into the water. That is almost 7 football fields long. There were houses and shops built along the full length of it. They were surrounded by water, boats, merchants, and sailors. In front of his windows, Copley saw many exotic things being brought in from all over the world. Neighborhood boys were tough and mean to him because he liked to draw. He grew up in fear of the people he saw and heard, except for the wealthy merchants who fascinated him. He began to study and copy their ways of walking and talking, hoping he could someday be like them. When he was 10, his mother married again and they moved to his new father's house. His stepfather was an artist and taught him how to paint. He learned quickly, and as the years passed, he soon was able to earn a great income from his paintings. He sent a painting to London, where all of the best artists met. He wanted them to tell him what they thought of his painting. The painting he sent was of a young boy with a flying pet squirrel held by a small chain. While beautifully done, the people in England wrote back to him and criticized his work. This made him very unhappy. Little did he realize that they were actually amazed and impressed by his work. They were also fascinated by this colonial boy playing with a creature that resembled a rat. They had never seen this animal before. America had a wealth of new animals and flowers just waiting to be discovered. As the years went by, his town of Boston began to grow very angry with the mother country, England. The colonists felt they were being unfairly treated. Copley was friends with many of the men who felt this way and painted many of their portraits. One such person was John Hancock. He is the one who signed his name boldly on the Declaration of Independence. Legend has it that he said, "There, John Bull can now read my name without spectacles, and may now double his reward of 500 pounds for my head. That is my defiance." John Bull was another name for King George III of England. Hancock is painted seated at a fine mahogany desk with a quill in his hand. We can easily imagine his penning his name on that famous document. His clothes are those of a wealthy gentleman, but his eyes are full of fire, ready to serve his country. Copley also painted what are known as political paintings, paintings that are not just a fine portrait, but a statement about something of which the sitter is strongly against. This painting of Paul Revere is one such portrait. He was a silversmith by trade, but he is better known for his famous ride. Every detail is included in this painting, even the black that is under his nails from his silver making. He is dressed in a well-made shirt showing lots of fabric. Normally, a man would be painted in a gentleman's coat, never in just a shirt. This, however, is not just any shirt. The people of Boston were required to import all their linen from England. The women in Boston were so upset with this rule that they made over 100 yards of this fabric, and Revere is showing it off in this painting. We see him pictured sitting at a fine mahogany table showing us a piece of his silver. We see his kind but determined face. Imagine how he must have looked that night riding with all his speed to warn the colonists that the redcoats were coming. This is Samuel Adams. He is standing defiantly, pointing to the charter and seal of Massachusetts granted by King William and Queen Mary, while grasping in the other hand a petition signed by citizens angry with their king. Labeled as a firebrand, we see his face filled with outrage. We can almost hear his voice. Samuel Adams led the men in the Boston Tea Party. He is also one of the men whom the British soldiers were looking for the night that Paul Revere went on his famous ride. This is Mr. and Mrs. Mifflin. She stares at us as she defiantly weaves her own decorative fabric trim, declaring she will no longer buy imported goods from England. In a short span of time, Copley created priceless images of life and its heroes of our past. Copley fell in love and married a woman whose father was the owner of one of the tea ships involved in the Boston Tea Party. This man, who grew up in fear of arguing with angry people, tried desperately to stop the revolution by trying to get the British to return their tea ships to England. They did not. Since Copley's wife and her family were on the side of the British, he lived in fear for his family's safety. He thought he had no choice. Copley and his family left America. Though labeled Tories, Copley and his wife remained frantic over what was happening in America. How could they enjoy life in England when so many of their friends back home were suffering? They soon realized they were Americans and were thrilled the Americans were fighting for freedom. The next artist we will meet is Charles Willson Peale. His father also died when he was a young boy, leaving his mother, sisters, and brother very poor with no place to live. A kind friend let them stay in a house he owned. To earn money, Peale's mother began sewing dresses for other women. When strolling around town, Peale would draw pictures of the dresses worn by women of wealth. He would use these drawings to make patterns for his mother so she could make fashionable dresses for ladies. Soon she had a good business. Peale learned how to make saddles and watches. He even took apart his own watch to learn how to rebuild it. He still continued to paint. When he was 18, he fell in love with and married a girl named Rachel. They began a family, and he continued with his work. Peale was a self-made artist. There were no art museums, and he had never seen an art easel or a paint palette until he studied briefly under John Singleton Copley. He then was sent to England to study with Benjamin West. While staying with West, Peale received word that his only child had died, and this news sent him into a deep depression. He painted this portrait of his wife called Rachel Weeping. We see in this portrait the terrible grief of losing a child. In colonial times, death was always around them because they did not have medicines to fight diseases. Peale returned to America, and using his new skills he learned from studying under Benjamin West, he began receiving many requests for his artwork. In 1772, he was asked to paint George Washington at his home in Mount Vernon. It was to be the first portrait ever painted of the great leader. It was at this sitting that Peale and other guests witnessed the incredible strength of Washington while playing a game of pitch. Washington strolled out onto the lawn, picked up the heavy bar, and easily tossed it further than anyone else. Peale proceeded to do what he did best and painted Washington's portrait. This painting hung proudly in the parlor of Mount Vernon. At this same time, he also painted a miniature of Martha Washington that Washington wore around his neck until he died. Soon, Peale began to feel the winds of war. Like so many other colonists, he became furious with the actions of England and became a patriot, supporting the revolution. He joined the Continental soldiers in their fight for freedom from the English crown. In the beginning of the Revolution, the English army was destroying the American force, but the patriots did not give up. After an American victory at Trenton and then at Princeton, Peale's men were so overcome with exhaustion that they collapsed into a deep sleep. He could not bear to see his men suffer. His own feet filled with pain, he left camp to secure meat for his hungry men, brought it back to camp, and made his men a hot meal. When he tried to rouse them to eat, they were too exhausted. The next day he fed them in a field. Washington, noticing soldiers sitting in the field, rode over to see what was happening. Peel explained his men needed food and he was feeding them. Washington was pleased. But this was only one of Peel's many acts of kindness. After his men had marched for so many months, their shoes disintegrated and their feet were bleeding. Peel found leather skins, turned the fur inside out, and made moccasins for all of his men. When we think of Washington, we think of him as we see him on the $1 bill, a man carved out of stone. In Peel's portrait, we see Washington at an earlier age, as a powerful man about to become one of the greatest men to ever live. Peel captured his strength for all of us to see. Our last artist is Gilbert Stuart. You know him by the picture he painted of George Washington for the $1 bill. He had a very bad experience when he was 17. He kept it a secret forever, but he was never the same after that. He was very talented, but drank heavily and used snuff, a tobacco product. He went to England, where Benjamin West took him in, cared for him, and taught him how to paint. Stuart never drew a sketch on the canvas first, for he felt this made the painting less creative. Instead, he would pick up his brush and start painting. His paintings were always very relaxed, not rigid. When he finally began to straighten out his life, the American Revolution had been won, the Constitution written, and George Washington made president. Realizing there was money to be made by painting Washington because he was now idolized all over the world, Stuart came back to America. After letters of introduction, Stuart was invited to paint Washington. Stuart had always been able to converse with a portrait sitter, step into their minds, and place their souls on his canvas. But Washington kept him in awe with his powerful presence and stature. He tried to talk with the president about many things, but never seemed to break through to the man. Stuart was showy and exaggerated in his stories. He drank heavily and calmed his nerves with his snuff. Washington's virtue was his love of truth and dislike for vanity. Never had Stuart met a man like Washington. Stuart painted several portraits of Washington. One that we see daily is on the $1 bill. Another full-length painting of Washington hangs at the White House. It became famous when years after the Revolution, during another attack by the British, Dolly Madison, the wife of the then President Madison, removed it from its wall just before the British burned down the original White House in the War of 1812. Looking at these portraits, we can see that Washington is older, tired, and not the tower of strength he once was, yet the strength of his character is a force we can feel. As the years went by, Stuart fell more and more into drink and snuff, but not before masterfully recording the images of the founders of our country onto his canvases, many who became presidents, including Thomas Jefferson. Finally, he painted his very last work, John Adams. The portrait of the 90-year-old Adams was painted just months before he died. Although Stuart was also ailing, Adams's son persuaded Stuart to paint his father. It is the last portrait that Stuart painted, and it is a masterpiece. Adams is sitting on his red sofa in his house. We see a face upon which time has left its mark, but look closely into his eyes. Stuart has captured Adams' character for all to see and remember, a look that is determined and honorable. In only a few short months after the painting was completed, Adams would use that determination to stay alive until the 4th of July, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Friend and author of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson, would also die on that same day. Later that year, Gilbert Stuart would suffer a stroke and no longer be able to paint. 2 years later, a third stroke would take his life. Benjamin West continued to paint for the king, but as the years went by, the king began to lose his mind. He had never been the same after he had lost the colonies in the American Revolution. West had become feeble and was eventually placed on a sofa surrounded by his work and that of the old masters. He enjoyed looking at them until the day he died. Even in death, his right hand remained in the position of holding a brush. A cast was taken of his hand and for many years was kept as a holy relic. John Singleton Copley always wanted to return home to America but never did. In his last days, he said the greatest mistake he ever made was to leave America. He is considered the greatest painter America ever produced. The patriot, Charles Willson Peale, never stopped learning. He was an American Renaissance man. He outlived 3 wives and had 17 children. He dug up the bones of giant mastodons that used to roam the earth and held exhibits to view the skeletons. His son held a dinner party for 13, complete with a piano, all within one of the skeletons. Peale had the first science museum with all kinds of animals that he stuffed. He came up with the idea of preventive medicine that we still use today. He invented 6-foot-long brushes so that when he painted, he could be the same distance from his canvas as he was from the sitter. He became the first person to pose nude because no one else would do it, and he strongly believed that life drawing was an important part in becoming a great artist. He even became an experimental farmer. When Peale lost his teeth, he learned how to make a false set and came up with a way of glazing porcelain and attaching the teeth to a plate. This is how we make dentures today. When he was 86 years old, he went to visit a friend in hopes of meeting a new companion and 4th wife. He went by boat and on his arrival decided to carry his trunk the half-mile to his lodgings. The trunk began to strain his failing heart after his visit. He returned to Philadelphia and slowly his body began to give out. His daughter came to be with him, and he asked her to feel for his pulse. She said she could not find one, to which he replied, "No, it is gone." He closed his eyes. His daughter thought he was sleeping, but he had actually died. He was a remarkable man, a Renaissance man, an American patriot who symbolized the free spirit of an American. America's masters have left us a gift that is priceless, a pictorial image into the hearts and souls of those who were a part of making our country the greatest and most powerful in the world. The next time you go into a museum and view a portrait painted by one of our colonial artists, look at all the clues that tell you about that person. But most of all, look into the eyes and remember, this is one of the people who gave us our freedoms.